The Hashashin. The year is 1090. You are a vizier to the most powerful caliph in the Islamic world. One morning you wake up and find a dagger pressed into the pillow beside your head. No guard was disturbed. No door was forced. Pinned to the blade is a message that says, next time you won't wake up. You aren't dead yet. That's the point. They could have killed you. They chose not to. Yet. This is how the Hashashin ruled without an army, without a throne, and without a single battle they needed to win outright. Operating from Alamut Castle, perched 2,163 meters above sea level in the Alborz Mountains of Persia, they controlled a network of at least 50 mountain fortresses simultaneously across Persia and Syria. Historian Farhad Daftari, in his 1994 work on the Nizari Ismailis, identified that every detailed account of their operations came exclusively from the people they were trying to kill. Crusader Lord Conrad of Montferrat, King of Jerusalem, was assassinated in 1192 within hours of his own election, suggesting the order had embedded intelligence at the highest levels of Crusader command. When the Mongol conqueror Hulagu Khan destroyed Alamut in 1256, the scholar Atta Malik Juvaini personally supervised the burning of the library and then wrote about it, which is the only reason we know it happened at all. 2 centuries of membership rolls, assassination contracts, and doctrinal texts gone in a single campaign. Every account we have of how this order actually functioned was written by an enemy. We don't know what the archive said. We only know what the people who burned it claimed it said. The Spartan Krypteia. Every autumn, the Spartan state declared war on its own slaves, not a crackdown, not a riot, a program. Young Spartan men, specifically chosen from among those judged most intelligent and capable, were sent into the Laconian countryside alone, armed with only a short blade, with orders to kill any helot found moving after dark. Plutarch records this in his Life of Lycurgus, noting that the ephors, Sparta's 5 elected magistrates, issued a formal annual declaration of war against the helot population to give the killings legal standing. The helots outnumbered Spartan citizens by an estimated 7-to-1 at peak, making the social terror function structurally rational. Thucydides, in the 4th book of his History of the Peloponnesian War, records a separate incident in 424 BCE where 2,000 helots were selected for public honors, paraded through sanctuaries, and then vanished. He writes plainly that no one ever knew how each of them perished. Archaeologist Nigel Kennell identified the Krypteia as a formal graduation rite of the Agoge, Sparta's state education system, meaning it was institutional, budgeted, and deliberate. Historian Paul Cartledge at Cambridge argues the documentation gap was itself cultural policy. Sparta maintained oral transmission exclusively, making its inner workings structurally impossible to recover. But here is the detail that doesn't sit quietly. The young men selected were the best students, the future generals. Every man who would ever lead Sparta had personally carried out undocumented killings as his entry into the leadership class. Aristotle reportedly wrote an entire treatise on Spartan governance in which the Krypteia featured prominently. That work is gone. We have only a single sentence quoted by Athenaeus centuries later. The Sicarii. It is market day in Jerusalem somewhere around the year 50 CE. The square is packed for a festival. A Roman soldier stumbles. A curved blade has slipped between his ribs so cleanly that the man standing beside him doesn't register what happened for 10 full seconds. By then the killer is 40 feet away. Nobody saw anything. Nobody will say anything. The Sicarii, named for the Sika, a short curved blade of Thracian origin with no native Judean tradition, were documented by the historian Josephus in astonishing operational detail. He traces their ideological origins to Judas of Galilee, identifies Menahem ben Judah, Judas's grandson, as the leader who brought them to prominence during the revolt of 66 CE, describes their tactical preference for Passover and Pentecost crowds when Roman surveillance was at its maximum density, and records in Jewish War chapter 13 that their specific innovation was staging killings in the most public spaces possible to maximize psychological impact. Yigael Yadin's forensic excavation of Masada between 1963 and 1965 confirmed the physical presence of their final 960 holdouts and recovered ostraca bearing 12 personal names that some scholars interpret as a final membership lot, suggesting an enrolled, closed organization rather than a spontaneous movement. The Acts of the Apostles references an Egyptian who led 4,000 Sicarii into the desert, implying logistics and organizational structure. Byzantine historian Procopius, writing in the 6th century, references groups in the eastern Levant still practicing knife veneration in the old Judean manner, 400 years after Masada fell. But here is what Josephus admits without quite naming the problem. When the Sicarii fled to Alexandria after the fall of Jerusalem, the Jewish leadership there handed them to Rome rather than shelter them. Their own community turned them in. Some researchers ask what exactly they were doing that made them a threat not just to Rome, but to the people they supposedly served. The Roman frumentari. You are a grain merchant in Roman Antioch. The man who checks your cargo manifest every Tuesday knows your suppliers, your routes, your debts, your political associations. He is not a grain inspector. He has never been a grain inspector. He is the last face 3 provincial governors saw before dying of sudden illness, and his report about you is already on a ship to Rome. The frumentarii were Rome's intelligence operatives embedded inside the grain logistics system, and they were not secret. Over 200 Latin inscriptions identifying individual frumentarii by name and unit have been found across the empire from Britain to Syria. Cassius Dio, in Book 77 of his Roman history, states explicitly that Caracalla used them as assassins, not merely as spies. The Historia Augusta records Hadrian directing them to surveil senators, meaning the apparatus was routinely turned against Rome's own governing class. Historian Christopher Kelly estimates their network at peak covered every provincial capital simultaneously, reporting on governors, military commanders, and tax collectors directly to the imperial office. When Emperor Diocletian abolished them in 284 CE, his replacement, the agents in repus, was structurally identical. Same reach, same function, new name. If the abolition was a genuine reform, why create the same institution immediately afterward? The Codex Justinianus preserves the abolition decree and offers only the word abuses as justification, which in Roman bureaucratic language is a way of not specifying something. The operational files of the frumentarii do not appear in any subsequent Roman archive. 2 centuries of intelligence records, surveillance reports, and assassination contracts dissolved completely at the moment of the transition. Some researchers ask whether they were transferred rather than destroyed, buried inside the successor institution's classified holdings, and simply relabeled. The Medjay and Duat. The workers who built the Valley of the Kings knew everything. They knew the shaft depths, the false walls, the trap corridors, the exact location of every pharaoh's burial chamber. They held more state secrets than any living Egyptian outside the royal family. Somebody had to manage what happened to that knowledge. That somebody had a name that appears in exactly 3 surviving documents and nowhere else in the entire documentary record of ancient Egypt. Egyptologist Jaroslav Cherny, during his decades of study of the Deir el-Medina ostraca from the 1930s through the 1960s, identified fragments designating a group called the Medjay and Duat, which translates roughly as Medjay of the underworld, or medjay of the hidden place. The community of workers at Deir el-Medina generated approximately 10,000 surviving ostraca, one of the most complete records of daily life in the ancient world. We know their wages, their sick days, their grocery disputes. The people supposedly responsible for their security and silence appear 3 times and never again. All 3 ostraca date to the reign of Rameses III, around 1186 to 1155 BCE, the precise decade before the systematic tomb robberies documented in the Abbot Papyrus. That papyrus records a formal investigation naming medjay officers as suspects, not in committing the robberies, but in covering them up. Egyptologist John Coleman Darnell has noted that certain medjay patrol routes led to locations that should have been empty, suggesting surveillance of activity that wasn't supposed to be happening. A ritual night shift explanation has been offered. But men who were paid left records. These men appear only when something is being suppressed, investigated after the fact, or hushed. The inner grade of the Persian immortals. Herodotus called them the immortals. 10,000 elite Persian soldiers maintained at exactly 10,000 at all times, a replacement stepping forward the moment any man fell. An army that could not be depleted. The Persepolis Fortification Archive, approximately 30,000 administrative clay tablets recovered by Ernst Herzfeld in 1933 and studied extensively by Matthew Stolper at the University of Chicago, documents Persian palace administration in extraordinary detail. Routine entries cover wine allocations, travel rations, and individual labor records. Among them, Stolper's team identified a recurring allocation for a group of exactly 40 men designated by a symbol with no occupational title, receiving 3 times the standard ration of a palace guard. Every other group in the archive has a title, a function, a commanding officer. These 40 men have none of those things. They are budgeted, fed, accounted for, and completely unnamed in terms of purpose. The Persepolis entries date to the reign of Darius I, suggesting this formation predates Xerxes and was not temporary. Herodotus describes an inner tier of 1,000 within the immortals carrying gold-tipped pomegranate spears, indicating the unit already operated with internal grades. The Greek physician Ctesias of Cnidus served at the Persian court and reportedly documented palace elimination operations in his Persica. That text survives only in fragments summarized by Photius in the 9th century CE. The original is gone. Pierre Bryant, in his 2002 study of the Achaemenid Empire, notes the gap between what Greek sources describe of Persian palace operations and what the tablet's record is substantial enough to constitute a systematic omission. Ptolemy's campaign memoir, cited by Arrian, references certain Persian administrative records being transported to Egypt rather than destroyed. Some researchers ask what was in them and whether any of it still exists somewhere in what remained of Alexandria's collections. The Jinyue shadow operatives, the Ming Emperor Hongwu created the Jinyue, the embroidered uniform guard, in 1382 to spy on his own officials. That much is in every history book. What the history books pass over is the subunit whose names were never entered into the central register. The ones who reported through the emperor's personal seal only. The ones whose operational files were destroyed by imperial decree on April 25, 1644, the day the last Ming emperor hanged himself from a tree on Coal Hill as the dynasty collapsed. Historian Timothy Brooke, in his 2010 work on the Ming dynasty, identified a structural anomaly in the Jinyue's organizational records. A consistent discrepancy between the number of agents listed in the central register and the number receiving operational expense allocations. The unregistered excess ranges from dozens to several hundred across different reign periods. The Jinyue at their height numbered approximately 75,000 registered agents empire-wide, making a parallel shadow subunit statistically easy to conceal within normal administrative variants. Brooks' analysis identifies the discrepancy as most pronounced during the Wanli reign of 1572 to 1620, the same period in which a disproportionate number of officials died under ambiguous circumstances while traveling between postings. A 2007 excavation at a site in Nanjing associated with the early Jinyue headquarters uncovered a sealed underground chamber containing 23 iron document boxes, all empty, showing internal burn damage consistent with materials burned inside the boxes before sealing rather than fire spreading from outside. The Qing dynasty's official Ming history contains an editorial note acknowledging that Jinyue records for certain operational periods could not be verified. Chaos doesn't close boxes before burning them. That's procedure. The Iga ninja and the Bansen Shukai Gap. In the autumn of 1581, the warlord Oda Nobunaga led an army of 46,000 soldiers into the mountain province of Iga. He wasn't fighting a rival lord. He wasn't suppressing a tax revolt. He arrived coordinated simultaneous across multiple mountain valleys at once, which is not an improvised punitive campaign. That is a targeted operation. Nobunaga's biographer records the campaign in the Shincho Koki, and Jesuit missionary Louis Frois, in a letter dated 1582, describes the aftermath as including systematic house-to-house searches and the deliberate burning of documents, unusual enough to warrant specific mention in a report primarily about Christian missions. The destruction was near total. The single most important surviving document of the Iga tradition, the Bansen Shukai compiled by Fujibayashi Yasutake in 1676, explicitly states in its preface that it is a reconstruction from surviving oral tradition and fragmentary notes because the primary written manuals were destroyed in 1581. It cites at least 4 earlier texts by title. None of those texts exist. Historian Yamada Yuji at the Iga City Museum traced the genealogies of 43 Iga clan families through Edo period records and found that survivors of the 1581 campaign were systematically absorbed into Tokugawa service and officially reclassified as samurai retainers, erasing their prior operational identity. A province that operated a professional intelligence and elimination service for 2 centuries produced not one surviving pre-1581 administrative document of any kind. But Nobunaga's siege of the Ishiyama Honganji temple fortress took 10 years and ended in negotiated surrender. The library survived. He destroyed Iga in a single season. Some researchers ask whether the manuals he was looking for contained something more dangerous than technique, specifically a 2-century client list of every lord who had ever hired Iga and what those lords had paid for. The Thuggee. A British colonial officer named William Sleeman was investigating a single missing merchant in 1826 when the scale of what he had found became impossible to contain. Not one disappearance, hundreds. Not from one road, every major road in central India. Not from one decade going back as far as any living person could remember, and beyond that into a silence that stretched for centuries. The earliest textual reference to the Thuggee appears in the chronicles of the Persian language historian Ziauddin Barani around 1356 CE, describing a mass arrest of 1,000 Thuggee in Delhi under the Sultanate, and their disposal by exile to the Deccan, rather than formal prosecution, which is a way of closing a case without creating a documentary trail. Between that reference and Sleeman's investigation is nearly 500 years of near-total silence in the administrative records of the Mughal Empire, one of the most sophisticated administrative states in the pre-modern world. Sleeman's subsequent prosecution records, now held in the British Library Oriental collections, document confessions from approximately 3,000 convicted individuals between 1830 and 1848. The confessional descriptions of operational protocol, including a multi-person scouting advance called thipahi and ritual strangulation using a weighted cloth, are structurally identical to Barani's 1356 description across 5 centuries of supposed non-documentation. Historian Kim Wagner, even in his skeptical 2007 analysis of colonial construction of the Thuggee myth, acknowledges the 500-year documentation gap has no straightforward explanation. The Mughal Empire documented individual property disputes. It recorded the price of grain in provincial towns. Something was operating on every major road in India for 5 centuries, and the record simply decided not to see it. The Venetian Council of Ten's unnamed eliminators. The Republic of Venice was the most bureaucratically obsessive state in medieval Europe. Scholars today can reconstruct the price of pepper in Venice on specific days in the 14th century from their archives. The Council of Ten kept meticulous deliberation registers from their founding in 1310 onward. They filed their own authorized assassination contracts, their encrypted diplomatic correspondence, their covert operation approvals, all of it dated and cross-indexed, which is exactly what makes the physical excision of approximately 40 folios from the deliberation register covering the period 1415 to 1455 so specific a problem. Historian Frederick Lane noted the cut pages in a footnote in his 1973 History of Venice. A 1998 archival survey by Gaetano Causi and colleagues confirmed the scope and documented that the cut marks indicate removal by sharp blade rather than deterioration or fire damage, with ink transfer visible on adjacent leaves, proving the pages were present and written before removal. During the excised period, at least 11 politically prominent figures in northern Italy died under ambiguous circumstances, including 2 competing claimants to the Duchy of Milan and 3 Venetian mercenary captains who had begun negotiating with rival states. Historian John Julius Norwich identifies this exact period as Venice's most aggressive mainland territorial expansion, which required precisely the kind of operations the Council documented openly in every other era. But they filed destruction orders when they burned documents. There is a documented 1415 resolution authorizing the burning of specific diplomatic correspondence, and it is in the archive. You don't cut pages out of a bound ledger if you're willing to file a destruction order. The difference between burning and cutting is the difference between administration and concealment. Those ragged stubs are still visible in the archive today. Anyone can go and see them. 10 orders, 5 continents, 4,000 years, and the same pattern underneath all of them. Every civilization that built a covert capacity eventually faced the same problem. How do you erase the people who did what you needed done? The mainstream answer is consistent, and it deserves to be heard fairly. Archives burn in wars. Dynasties destroy inconvenient records. Administrative gaps are normal in pre-modern record-keeping, and absence of evidence is not evidence of anything. That is a reasonable position. But chaos does not cut pages out of bound ledgers with a sharp blade. Chaos does not produce empty iron document boxes with internal burn marks. Chaos does not make 40 unnamed men disappear from 2 centuries of palace accounting while their rations keep appearing in the budget column. The pattern here isn't conspiracy, it's policy. And policy requires a decision maker. Most people walk through the archives of history and see ordinary gaps. You made it to the end of this list, which means you're reading the gaps differently. Hit subscribe and stay in the archive. Then go to the comments and tell me which of these 10 erasures you think was the most deliberate. Not the most mysterious, the most deliberate. Make your case. History isn't what was recorded. It's what survived the people who decided what to record. Somewhere tonight, a ledger has ragged edges where the truth used to be. Subscribe, keep asking,